Survivors. Flood, Mississippi, 1927, Chapter 9. The first jolt knocked Garrett backward. The second was worse. He heard the dog yelp and Molly shout. Not words, just a loud cry. He managed to roll over and wedge the side of one foot down into a crack between two of the raft logs, pinning the drawer front beneath him. He struggled to hang on, lifting his head to see Molly. She had fallen sideways across the raft and was clawing at the logs with her right hand, trying to find the rope. Her left arm was doubled around the dog, clutching it awkwardly against her body. The dog looked terrified, but it was still not fighting Molly's grip. "I've got you!" Garrett yelled as he stretched out and captured her wrist. A moment later, with him guiding her, Molly found the rope. The drawer front was digging into Garrett's side, and he shifted his weight to ease the sharp pain. The raft was shuddering now, crashing through hummocks of water, capped by white foam and early sunlight. Sheets of water fanned over them, and Garrett longed to wipe his eyes, but was afraid to. The raft bounced and jittered, and he clenched his jaw, blinking, watching Molly as well as he could. She was managing to hold on with one hand, but he could see the effort it was costing her. Her face was contorted into a fierce frown. Garrett loosened his grip to reach beneath himself and repositioned the drawer front. Then he closed his hand around the rope again. Molly's frown had become a grimace. "Give the dog to me!" he shouted at her. Her eyes had been closed, but now she opened them long enough to meet his stare and shake her head. "If it gets away," she yelled back, "it'll drown!" Garrett was about to answer when the raft tilted so steeply that Molly and the dog were perched above him for a second, silhouetted against the blue sky. Then they crashed back down as the raft righted itself. The dog yelped as the raft hit the surface of the water. Garrett was afraid the terrified animal would snap at Molly's face, inches from its own, but it didn't. It stood beside her, her left arm around its belly. Its paws were splayed out as it fought for balance. The rough water went on a long time, the raft hammering against uneven currents. Garrett saw Molly struggling to keep hold of the dog, but there was nothing he could do to help her. One smashing jolt followed the next so closely that he had no time to reset his grip on the rope, to do anything but hang on. The water beneath the raft was so turbulent that it spewed up from beneath the logs, cold and dark. When the water finally calmed a little, Garrett found himself curled up around the drawer front, both hands tangled in the rope, his whole body shaking. He straightened his legs and turned over, afraid that Molly would not be there. But she was. And so was the dog. He looked down to see the drawer front sliding across the logs, and he immediately pulled it back, amazed that he had forgotten it. Without it, they had no way to steer the raft. "Are you all right?" Garrett shouted at Molly, his voice sounding too loud now that the water was quieter. The sun was well up. How much time had gone by while they had been caught in the rough water? She turned to look at him. "I think so." She scooted into a half-sitting position, and Garrett saw streaks of blood on her knees from the rough bark. The dog scrambled on the slick logs, and Molly loosened her hold on it, murmuring comforting nonsense to calm it down. "We have to find it something to eat," Molly said, looking up. "For ourselves, too," Garrett added. He released both hands long enough to stretch. Then he picked up the drawer front in his right hand and took hold of the rope again with his left. He watched the water in front of the raft. It was much calmer here, and he was sure they were out of the river course now. They somehow had ended up east of the levees, floating above flooded farmland. There were hundreds of rounded treetops sticking up out of the brown water. "I'm going to try to turn the raft again," he told Molly. "If we go far enough eastward, maybe we can find a place to get out of the river." Molly was fussing with the dog's coat, rubbing at it the way a mother would warm a chilled child. She looked up long enough to nod at him. "You need help?" Garrett shook his head. "I don't think so. No, not here. If the water gets rough again, I will." All of a sudden the dog yipped, lifting its muzzle to bark at the sky. Then it stood up and shook droplets, flying into Garrett's face. Molly turned her head, laughing. Garrett found himself smiling, too. There was something so everyday about the dog shaking that the idea of them being in the middle of a flood, who knew how far from home, was almost funny. Garrett's laughter died when he saw the look of sadness cross Molly's face. "How can we laugh when we don't even know if our own families are alive?" He shrugged, confused by how angry her words made him. He scooted closer to the back edge of the raft. "Hang on to the dog, but you keep a tight hold onto that rope, too." He lowered the smooth wood into the water, using the drawer pull as a grip. He did it slowly this time, and the raft responded without jerking. Molly turned to flash a smile at him, and he felt his anger dissolve. The dog sat down beside her, huddling companionably against her side. The drowned trees gradually drew near. The farther they got from the main channel of the river, the slower the water moved. The slower it moved, the quieter it got. Garrett felt awed in the silence. Molly sighed, and he could hear her clearly. From a distance he heard bird song. The world had become calm again. The water was too muddy to tell how deep it was, but as they glided close to the first of the trees, Garrett looked up to see a mockingbird's nest only 5 feet above his head. The mother bird glared and jabbered at him until he was well past. It was odd floating silently into the high branches like this. He wondered what was beneath the raft, covered by the brown water. Someone's house? A barn full of dead mules and drowned chickens? A family? "Where do you suppose we are?" Molly asked quietly. Garrett shrugged. "We've come a ways, that's for sure. Maybe we're clear down past Ben Lomond, or all the way to Shiloh." Molly tilted her head, listening. "Do you hear someone hollering?" Garrett listened hard for a full minute, then shook his head. "If they were, they're quiet now." "What are we going to do?" Molly pushed her hair back with both hands. Garrett met her eyes. "Get to land and find help, I guess." Molly had let go of the dog and was sitting with her hands in her lap. Garrett realized that there was almost no pressure on the drawer front, and he lifted it out of the water and laid it on the raft. He stretched, arching his back, aware of every tired muscle, every bruise. He lifted his face toward the incredible warmth of the sun. He had been chilled so long that he could almost feel the cold seeping out of him into the warm morning air. Mosquitoes hummed around them. "This is like heaven," Molly said softly, and he nodded, understanding her perfectly. The water here was not trying to kill them. He crawled across the raft, gently nudging the dog to one side. Hoping it was shallow enough, he untied his pole and slid it downward. He tried angling it one way, then the other. Nothing. He worked it deeper, pushing it in, arm's length, beneath the surface, but it was no good. The water was calm, but it was still too deep. "Wish we had a motor," he said sadly, rocking back on his heels. He put the pole next to the drawer front, then lay on his back, wincing. "I wish we had breakfast." Molly's voice was soft and wistful. The dog whined quietly, as if it had understood her. "I'm sorry I lost my paddle." "I almost lost mine. You saved the dog. It'd be a pretty one, if it weren't so real thin. Maybe we can get it all the way home with us." Molly nodded. "Maybe. Pa would probably let me keep him." She touched the dog's shoulder. It moved closer so that she could scratch its ears. Garrett lay flat, letting the raft drift through the trees. He closed his eyes against the dappled sunlight, wishing for food and a softer bed, but grateful to be alive and away from the murderous current. "What's that sound?" Molly asked. Garrett listened. He could just hear something above the distant roar of the water. It took his tired mind a moment to recognize it, but when he did, he sat bolt upright. Airplane! He grabbed the drawer front and started paddling. They'd be looking for people stuck on the river. The drawer front made a poor paddle at best. It was hard to hold and harder to guide, but he got the raft moving slowly back toward the open river. The sound of the airplane grew louder and louder. Molly was turning, neck craned and one hand shading her eyes. I think I see it. The sun is glinting off something." Garrett lowered his head and put every ounce of his strength into paddling. It was almost impossible to make the raft go straight, and he had to keep scooting from one side to the other. The dog jumped out of his way, barking at him once or twice. Molly tried to quiet it, then began using her hands to paddle, trying to help. When the airplane roared overhead, they were still under the trees. Molly jumped to her feet, waving her hands and shouting. Garrett staggered up to stand beside her, rumbling at the buttons on his shirt, peeling off to wave in a futile circle above his head, shouting at the top of his lungs. The plane flew straight on, following the river. The sound of the engine faded.